During this session, help each member to respond to the tasks that you have laid out for them. As Barbadians, renew our faith, strengthen our hope, enlighten our understanding, enlarge our charity, especially to those in need, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
This House is now in session. Minutes for the meeting held on Tuesday, June 8th, 2021 to be confirmed.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that the aforesaid minutes be confirmed.
The question is that the aforementioned minutes be confirmed. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. The aforementioned minutes are hereby confirmed.
Announcements by Your Honor the Speaker. Messages from Her Excellency the Governor General. Petitions. Papers.
Honorable Leader of Government Business.
Mr. Speaker, I am commanded to lay the annual report of the Student Revolving Loan Fund for the financial year ending March 31st, 2020.
Government notices, private members notices, notices of questions, reports from select committees, first readings of bills. Two first readings, sir.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I beg to move that.
Honorable Member for St. James Central.
Beg your pardon, sir. I beg to move that the Control of Inefficient Lighting Bill be read a first time.
Question that the aforementioned bill be read a first time. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the first reading of the Companies Economic Substance Amendment Bill 2021.
The question is that the aforementioned bill be read a first time. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Statements by ministers, congratulatory and/or obituary speeches, personal explanations, motions for leave of absence, oral replies to questions, notices of motions for the adjournment of the House on matters of urgent public importance, orders of the day.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the suspension of standing orders 6, 16, 18, 20, 42 subsection 5, 43, and 44 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that the aforementioned standing orders be suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. The aforementioned standing orders are hereby suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting.
Government business, sir.
Government business is the order of the day.
Order number 3, in the name of the Honorable Minister of International Business and Industry, to move the second reading of the Companies Economic Substance Amendment Bill 2021.
Honorable Member for St. Michael North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, from the inception, it has been the intention of this government to ensure that Barbados becomes and remains a financial services center of excellence. And the amendment before us today, Mr. Speaker, has to be seen in that context. Because in that context, we have to be, and also be seen to be, a very well-regulated jurisdiction compliant with international standards. And if I can just give Mr. Speaker a little background to how we arrived at where we are today. You would recall that in 2018, by the end of 2018, between the period of June to the end of 2018 when we formed the government, we repealed altogether or amended in total some 14 pieces of legislation, removing things like ring fencing and other issues that had been raised by the OECD and the European Union to satisfy with their requirements and initiatives. Significantly also, Mr. Speaker, we then also converged all of our corporate tax rates between the domestic corporate tax rates and the international business corporate tax rates. We converged them downwards to the point where we ended up in a range of taxation ranging from 1% to 5.5% applicable to all entities operating in Barbados, all companies operating in Barbados. When we did that, Mr. Speaker, we then we dismantled a system, a tax structure we had in place for some 4 decades, which we created specifically to ensure we carved a niche for ourselves in the international business sector, properly so-called. We had to dismantle that entire structure and regime based on commitments given by the previous administration, which, having given the commitment, had no plans in place whatsoever and had made no moves, taken no real significant steps to ensure that they complied with the obligations that they give. It fell upon us to do it. Having converged, Mr. Speaker, our tax rates, as I just said, we then became a low-tax jurisdiction for the OECD, or for the European Union's purposes, we became a Criterion 2.2 jurisdiction, which really meant pretty much the same thing and triggered the same thing from both of them, which was that having become a low-tax jurisdiction, it then became a requirement for us to enact economic substance legislation. Now, Mr. Speaker, what is before us today is largely a requirement by the European Union. And the OECD, but more particularly so the European Union, felt that low-tax jurisdictions, which Barbados had become for sure in 2018, quote, should not facilitate offshore structures or arrangements within their jurisdictions that are attracting or earning profits which do not reflect real economic activity in the jurisdiction in which they are relevant. In other words, Mr. Speaker, the concern was that a number of usually multinational corporations could exploit gaps and loopholes in the international tax system whereby they could set up their businesses in jurisdictions and take advantage there of paying low rates of taxes. So you had, as a result of that, the creation of some shelf companies, dummy corporations, and the like. So what was then required was that it was felt that if companies wanted to take advantage of low rates of tax, you should put economic substance legislation in place, as well as measures to effectively monitor compliance with the legal requirements set out in the economic substance legislations. And these economic substance requirements related to what are called relevant activities, which are spelled out in the legislation at section 9 of the Economic Substance Act. And it only really applies, the economic substance legislation really only applies to these things, which are called geographically mobile activities. These are things that can be moved around the place pretty fast, and people can exploit the loopholes, as I said, in the international tax arena to ensure that they can have a so-called operation in a jurisdiction and be able to pay the taxes, lower rates of tax in those jurisdictions. And those activities, the relevant activities as at Section 3, are banking business, insurance business, fund management business, finance and leasing business, headquarters business, shipping business, holding company business, intellectual property business, distribution and service center businesses, and such other activities as may be prescribed by the minister. So, Mr. Speaker, clearly those are things that can be settled here today, and gone tomorrow. And if you look, for example, to illustrate the point, at intellectual property business, you can see it perhaps most markedly there, where an entity can have all of the research and development necessary to create some product or issue going on in a jurisdiction in Hawaii or New South Wales or wherever. All the research and development is going on there. But they set up a company in Barbados, say, to receive the royalties, because Barbados will be a low tax jurisdiction. And then when it comes time to pay the taxes are paid here by the company in Barbados for all the royalties that it receives at a rate of, well, 1%. While in fact, all the economic activity generating that product that attracted intellectual property issues was being done in another jurisdiction altogether. So you had to plug that loophole. So what now is required is that companies carrying on any of those activities that I just listed must conduct what is called their core income generating activities in Barbados if they are to benefit from the low rate of tax that we offer. Which means that, according to the legislation, depending on the level of income that you derive from the business, you must have an adequate number of qualified full-time employees in the jurisdiction in which you're operating. Now, those employees must be physically present in the jurisdiction. You must have adequate operating expenditure, and you must have adequate physical assets if you're speaking about Barbados, in Barbados as well. And in addition to that, the company must be directed, managed, and controlled in Barbados. You must have your board meetings, records of what is discussed at board meetings and the like. All that must happen in Barbados. So there should be no skullduggery. No skullduggery, Mr. Speaker. You cannot have a company deriving some $600 million from quote-unquote operations in Barbados, but yet still have no plan, have maybe just one or two people set up in Barbados, and you're not really spending any money here, no investment, but it's just somehow managing to pay the low rate of tax that we offer. So, Mr. Speaker, we were required to pass, and we did pass, the Economic Substance Act. Quite arguably, quite frankly, Barbados always had due regard for businesses of substance. We were never a jurisdiction that ever encouraged the setting up of dummy corporations and unshelf companies or the like. Exactly. We were never that sort of jurisdiction. We also have been a country that invested very, very heavily in the education and training of our people. And when I have traveled the few times that I did, Mr. Speaker, promoting Barbados on road shows, And I mentioned the extent of our investment in education and training of our people. Most the people listening to us marveled, because we have, they marvel at the fact that the country is able to carry its level of educating its people right up from primary, right up to tertiary level. They marvel at it. So we have that cadre, Mr. Speaker, of highly trained and qualified people to service entities that want to set up in Barbados. We have that. So Barbados has not been a country that really sought to go after companies registering in Barbados who did not need employees, because we were always in a position to provide these trained employees to these companies whenever they sought to come to Barbados. So enacting economic substance legislation really was not any burden that we had to carry. It fitted in very naturally with our concept of how businesses should operate in Barbados, and the training that should go into equipping the population with being able to do the jobs that were needed. And we enacted the legislation. In fact, in 2018, we enacted, could I have some water? We actually enacted economic substance legislation in 2018 as part of the 14 pieces of legislation I mentioned earlier. One was the economic substance legislation. It fully satisfied the requirements of the OECD, but then the European Union decided that it was not enough for them. So we had to then engage in dialogue with them to, first of all, we had to try to get clarification as to what really were the issues that they found so unsatisfactory in relation to the one that was approved and agreed to by the OECD, that we had to go off to do a separate one for them. But we had to play ball with them, as you would say. And in 2019, we actually repealed the one that we had done in 2018 and enacted the one that we now have. So Mr. Speaker, that is where we are today. We have a very comprehensive Economic Substance Act. But as it now stands, Mr. Speaker, it only applies to companies. It does not presently apply or include partnerships. But even in 2019, Mr. Speaker, even as we were working on that economic substance legislation that the European Union had been pressing us to do, they were looking further than companies. They were looking at the whole issue of partnerships and whether partnerships as well shouldn't be included in domestic economic substance legislation. And what they were finding was that different countries were dealing with the issue of partnerships differently in relation to whether or not they were being incorporated in their domestic economic substance legislation. And they decided that they wanted uniformity across all lower tax jurisdictions. And they relied actually on some wording in their terms of reference for their criterion 2.2, which I mentioned earlier, which obliges lower tax jurisdictions to require companies, quote, and any other undertaking carrying on relevant activities to have a substantial economic presence, meaning that they should include partnerships in their economic substance legislation. And the European Union used that wording that I just mentioned, along with some dialogue and so on that they had with us, questionnaires that they sent to us, and in the end they determined that Barbados should include more clearly, because in my submission, the wording in our legislation already too, the same way that they use that wording to say that we should include partnerships. Our wording, in my view, in our legislation was sufficient to also include partnerships. But they're the ones that said that it wasn't clear enough to them, and they wanted it spelled out in very, very clear terms that partnerships would be included in our economic substance legislation, and that it should be done by the 1st of July. Significantly, Mr. Speaker, on this occasion, I can't say that Barbados has been targeted singly in this whole exercise because it has also been required to be done in other jurisdictions as well, and I can name a few: Anguilla, Bermuda, BVI, Cayman Islands, Guernsey, the Isle of Man, and Jersey. All of them also have to include partnerships in their domestic economic substance legislation. So that now once this amendment carries today, we will now have partnerships included on an equal footing under the definition of resident company in the Economic Substance Act. In real terms, in terms of real impact, I don't know that this is anything that we will have to lose a lot of sleep over, quite frankly, because there are in Barbados, in 2016, there were only some 22 limited partnerships. General partnerships, I think there were less than 100 of those. So in real terms, I don't know that it's going to be a big deal. Furthermore, partnerships will only be subject to the requirements of the economic substance legislation, which is filing annual economic substance declarations and so on, if they engage in relevant activities, which is the ones I mentioned earlier, banking, etc. They will only be affected by this if they engage in those types of activities. And you know that in Barbados, for most partnerships, historically, partnerships in Barbados have largely engaged in accounting, accounting firms, law firms, and perhaps some medical activities as well. But in terms of geographically mobile activities and the like that fall in the legislation, I don't really hear of many partnerships being involved in those types of activities. So I really think that there are going to be any real issues for partnerships going forward, to be honest. But this is one of the things that we were required to do. In terms, Mr. Speaker, of the, I know there is a rule in Parliament against anticipating, but I know that on occasions, my friend, the leader of the opposition, has spoken about the whole issue of the performance of the international business sector and what does it contribute. We have converged our taxes. So what is the net result? What is the result now in terms of tax revenues and corporate taxes for the government as a result of this convergence? And I can tell you that I'm not going to be the one to bring tales officially out of schools. There are other ministers who can give the details, but every now and again a little birdie might speak to me, a birdie that sometimes happens to be on a truck, and may hear a little something along the way, and may mention something you might hear. And I can say, without giving the details, that the facts are that corporation taxes have performed better than expected, and in fact they have exceeded projections as at the 15th of June this year. They have performed better and exceeded projections as at the 15th of June this year. And this better than projected corporate tax rate has boosted Barbados' foreign reserves at the central bank. I can say that for a fact. And I can go further and say that this has resulted in a reduction of government's overall overdraft facility at the central bank as well. I can say that for a fact. I can also go further and say that this is not me speaking. The authorities, if you look at the recent pronouncements of the central bank governor in relation to the sector, he also said that international business accounted for the majority of the 612.9 million corporate tax earned between April 2020 and March 2021. And the president of BIWA also said that this sector was the only one to add to corporate tax revenue with a 15% increase for the last 12 months. So, Mr. Speaker, this sector has been resilient. It has been one of those sectors that has had its share of trials and tribulations over the last year or more. We have to be dealing with constantly shifting goalposts all the time, dodging bullets, but the sector has been as resilient as could have been expected in the circumstances, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, before I sit, I would have to, and I've been instructed to by the Minister of Finance as well earlier this morning, that there's an issue that it is not on the lips of Barbadians as such, but it's certainly on the lips of those in the sector and looking on and reading and so on about the sector. And it's this issue that has surfaced for a little while now, to be honest, about this issue of the global minimum corporate tax rate, and where the current percentage being mentioned is some 15%, a global minimum corporate tax rate of some 15%. Now, this is not something that has caught the recent bold pronouncement by G7, led or mouthed largely by the United States. This is not something that has caught the Barbadian authorities by surprise. It has not caught us by surprise. We have known about this for some time, and this is being engaged, or is engaging the intention of the top economic, financial, and tax brains of this country, and also those stationed overseas as well, who are all playing a part in looking at this issue to mount as best a response as we can. It hasn't taken us by surprise. But this is one of those instances where might tends to be right, unfortunately, and where small states end up being tossed around. Because in this proposal, you have one of the greatest contradictions that there could ever be. Because when these countries like such as Barbados, became low tax jurisdictions, the very thing that they said was that is okay. You can be a low tax jurisdiction. But to maintain that status, and we will leave you alone, if you enact economic substance legislation. Economic substance legislation was their creature. They are the ones who said that. It is fine and good to have a lower tax jurisdiction, be a lower tax jurisdiction. Put substance in place, make sure that everybody operating there is carrying on real economic activity. Let their core income generating activities be there, and that is okay. We did that. And these things don't come cheap. They don't come cheap in terms of time or resources, human and financial resources. And you go and you do that. And then having jumped the hurdle now, and you figure, well, after settle down here, no, working with God, then no come and decide, no. But you can have a minimum tax rate, but it got to be, say, 15% or whatever percent, and it's going to be global, So you I can't speak in definitive terms as yet because it's not yet finalized. I suppose a lot more will be known, say, by the end of July or so. There'll be a lot more that you can perhaps know with more certainty. But the thing is that if you decide, okay, I'm not going to impose a 15%, I'm going to stick to my 5%. This is what the current position seems to be. And you decide, okay, I'm going to stick to my 5.5%, and you charge the entity here 5.5% in its country of citizenship or wherever it came from, it will have to pay the difference. So it's going to pay 15% in any case. So when you charge less, you are not going to make. And so you're not going to have to go to pursue the arduous task again now of differentiating yourselves from other jurisdictions now, all of whom will have to be charging 15%. Now, the argument that we intend to use, we have already started to use to push back on this, is precisely what I said just now, that you told us to enact economic substance. You're a creature, not mine. So in implementing this minimum global corporate tax rate, you have to give us some credit for that. They have to give us a carve out. We're calling it an economic substance carve out. You got to give us some recognition for what you tell us to do. So we're getting, they seem to be tossing a little something saying that, yes, we recognize that. We will look at it. They're looking at it. But what it will end up being in the end is anyone's guess at this point. But certainly this is where unity, we were expecting some sort of unity in this. Barbados can't push back on this alone and get anywhere. So there's going to have to be the mountain of some serious awareness among states in similar positions so that we can all speak in a unified voice on this. This may or may not be, because it's still being decided, it may or may not be a blacklisting issue. I do not think it would be that type of issue so far. But in the past, I must say that there has not been a lot of success with trying to get to speak with their regional voice on these things. I remember when in 2018, Barbados was being, and a couple of other countries in the region were being threatened about being blacklisted on this same economic substance issue, when all we were asking was for some clarification on what the European Union was telling us to do. Just clarification. And I know my friend, opposition leader, speaks about you can't let these people tell you do this and make you do this and make you do that. But the fact of the matter is that there are consequences for what you do. And I will challenge the honorable member to say that if he were standing where I stand, having to do what I do, if he would say to them, in effect, go to hell, I'm a sovereign state. We tried that too, not to go to hell, but we did tell them back in 2018, 2019, letters were written by no less a person than the Prime Minister of this country, not saying go to hell, but making the point that give us some clarification. We are a sovereign nation. Give us some clarification. And these fellas do not budge. They don't budge what Frank Walker said, 1 millimeter of an inch. They don't budge. And then you mount a delegation to go over to deal with it. Only 3 CARICOM countries participate in the delegation. Only 3 go with you. And then you come back, you hold your ground, you get blacklisted. And let me tell you something, Mr. Speaker. When you're blacklisted, you have no friends. You have no friends. You have a set of vultures who fly around waiting to see when you're dead, to come down and pounce and eat away at all your flesh. They're no friends when you're blacklisted. Even some people in your own jurisdiction that rally with you all the time in the form of some service providers, that work with you all the time. They know your standards, they know your level of commitment to integrity, they know all that. But just a single pronouncement of the words blacklisting changes their perception of you. And you don't get calls of endearment from them, Mr. Speaker. You get calls telling you in a veiled way the threats that you're explaining the position, how right you were, and how much you're doing. And this is like if that going on one year, come up through the next. All they want to hear from you is when you getting off that blacklist, my man. When you going to get Barbados off the blacklist, because my client's leaving. So you don't have any friends, Mr. Speaker, when you get on the blacklist. You feel very much alone. So I thank God that right now the Ministry of International Business has Barbados on no blacklist. None whatsoever. And Mr. Speaker, as I said at the beginning and I will end now, we intend to be and remain being a financial services center of excellence. We have to be very, very well regulated. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, that is the context in which the short bill that is before us today is before us, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful, I'm obliged. And Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Question that the bill be read a second time. All those honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. Honorable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will try to allay my honorable friend's worst fears by being brief and gentle of hand with him. I would want to assure him at the outset that I would never say it to anybody, individual or corporate being, go to hell, because it goes against the nature of what I understand, believe very strongly, forever and forever, to be my calling. So I have never said it before, would not suggest to him to say it to anybody, and I don't plan to say it to anybody going forward. This legislation is very much about the whole business of partnerships. We passed economic substance legislation already, and this is just to include in the capture of that bit of legislation the entities we refer to as partnerships. It is not likely, therefore, that my honorable friend will find opposition over here to the measure, because he seeks further to bring our country and our economy in line with global arrangements and global standards. I do, however, differ with him with respect to his view of the future. In fact, with respect to partnerships, he referred to the now existing position, the status quo, and indicated that he doesn't see a change with respect to that for the future. I don't know that I agree with him. We now live in a time and day which is far removed from that we knew not so long ago. Capital is very, very, very mobile today, and very swift of speed. So I don't think that we should be looking at these very important issues through any static eyes. Supply chain dynamics are also very prominent in the global economy today. Companies seek to benefit and entities seek to benefit from the use of those dynamics to the advancement and enhancement of their interests. We now live in a world which is driven largely by the presence of technology in various forms. So the world of yesterday, which threw up for Barbados a certain tendency towards business partnerships, towards that entity, that world has long changed. The dynamics are such today that I expect that that particular configuration of business entity that we know as partnership will change in multiplied instances, and the numbers that my honorable friend 10 years from now, when he is still a member of this house and this honorable house and still a minister of this cabinet, or by that time perhaps heading it, or if he happens to be on the opposition side, which is perhaps a bit more likely, then I am sure he will speak in this vein, and he would refer to numbers multiplied many times before those numbers which he gave. This impulse towards this type of change in the legislation of several countries, the honorable member mentioned several of them, some in the region and some beyond, who are captured by this impulse on the part of OECD and EU, these entities, to respond to what they see as harmful tax practice dispositions and policy positions being adopted by jurisdictions such as ours. This is part of what they call their fair tax platform or fair tax principle, to counter what is very obviously highly mobile geographical business activities. The honorable member mentioned about 7 or 8 of them, categories or types of activities designated as relevant activities. And here is an attempt to ensure that tax luring, L-U-R-I-N-G, I think that's the correct spelling, jurisdictions do not benefit from the disposition of some of these countries to move where those tax privileges apply. And therefore, is seeking to widen the net and to make sure that all of the entities possible are captured in that net. And our legislation to them, and in their view, was deficient because it did not speak to partnerships. Barbados was not the only jurisdiction cited for that. I think the Honourable Minister also intimated that there were several others. So we want to make sure that businesses seeking more favorable tax jurisdictions fall in line with the regulations accepted globally, and that countries such as Barbados are up to speed with the rest of the world on that matter. It is indeed a challenge to sovereignty, and there is a limited amount of a limited response that sovereign states of our size and means can make in the face of the might of the world. And it is unfortunate, I think again the Honourable Minister alluded to this, that we are like crabs in a barrel when it comes to this type of thing, and rather than go it together and provide a stronger platform, a platform of greater strength, we tend to operate in silo fashion. We look out for our insular interests to the detriment of all of us eventually, because then that might which we inevitably must face becomes even mightier. And countries like Barbados and some of the others which were cited by my honourable friend are made to suffer. So these are challenges to our sovereignty. And I think if we are going to express that sovereignty, we must mount what pushback we are able to do. I am not so naive as not to understand how the world works today. I'm not so naive as to not to understand that in the mind of many, might is right, and that therefore there is sometimes very little that sovereign states unfortunately can do to counter these things, these dictates. But I don't think that feebly we are expected either simply to sit back and to take every slap in the face, every push down, every pushback that comes from the world of might, because after all, we are sovereign states. Stipulations like these imposed upon countries like ours, beyond being challenges to sovereignty, create for us uncertainty with respect to decision making and policy shaping and policy formulation. I remember distinctly, and the Honourable Minister would recall this himself, not too very long ago, the administration here changed the corporate tax bands in Barbados, the corporate tax levels in Barbados. I think former Barbados Labour Party administration had it at 30%. I think this administration dropped it to 25%. And within a few months, because of the pressures obtaining in the global tax environment among the institutions of might and power, suggested for us that it would be more prudent to reverse that and to drop our levels even more so significantly. So the point I'm making is that these things create for us, and I sympathize with my honourable friend, and I can hear almost his plaintive cries. I sympathize with him because these things create for governments in countries like ours that uncertainty about policy formulation and policy shaping. The result of that is that when we are not moving with a high degree of certainty with respect to policy, tax policy, financial policy, then we are sending uncertain signals to potential investors, to the potential business community, and then that itself creates economic injury for us. There is and will always be this shark-like shark-like tax protectionist disposition on the part of these industrialized countries. And perhaps I'll say a few words myself on the recent G7 decision, since the honorable member raised it maybe in a moment or so. But these shark-like tax protectionist dispositions that are exhibited by the industrialized countries reflect I don't think it reflects a lack of understanding. It reflects a lack of appreciation and sensitivity to our positions as vulnerable economies existing in the type of environments that we do. If you look at the persisting position with reference to concessional financing for countries like Barbados, and always the reference to that indicator of GDP per capita, without reference to anything else. This, just like that, similarly demonstrates a lack of appreciation for the plight of these countries. This recent G7 decision, Mr. Speaker, is coming in the wake of rising debt levels among small state developing economies like Barbados. We are into debt now that we will be paying back for years. Debt created by the COVID impact, which comes on top of already high debt profiles, particularly if you talk about Barbados in this context. Yeah, and the move now of these countries to seek to further ensure that their shark-like dispositions and aims realize come, to my view, at the expense of countries such as us. And that is the world in which we live, and that is why we need, as far as we can, as a region, to respond together on these things. And beyond even being a region in the Caribbean, being part of a small economy, small states platform and architecture that speaks with a singular voice and responds strongly to the threats that come from the mouthings and the decisions of these people. 15% global minimum tax rate is the trend that is being suggested. It has emerged in recent times. The Honourable Minister is of the view that, well, you know, it's not yet cast in stone. And I agree with him, and I think the group of 20 industrialized nations will look at that as a wider forum in a month or so, or during the course of next month. And my view is that, yeah, it's not set in stone, but you might find that any change to it will suggest further disadvantage to economies such as ours. Because this is the nature of these industrialized countries. This is the nature of the world in which we live. If you listen to the words of the U.S., the equivalent to our Minister of Finance, Treasury Secretary, this is supposed to be a counter to that race to the bottom. Now, the G7 and other industrialized nations will see tax policy implemented by jurisdictions such as ours as part of a race to the bottom. So this is supposed to counter that race to the bottom. Now, they speak with loud mouth on those issues without recognition of the ramifications of policies that take away business from these economies, that create social dislocation, high levels of employment, the crime that it is going to induce, and the potential impact for their own jurisdictions because of dynamics operating in countries such as ours. So it's a counter to race to the bottom. This business that countries can still apply the tax rate that they choose to do, but that the 15% would be still arrived at by topping it up at home, the home of the business entity in question. That is the position right now. Charge whatever percentage you want. At home, we will top it up. Now, I don't know that that position will hold. I believe a set hard figure will be the eventual result. And this business of topping it at home is not going to apply. But even if it applies, once you do that and you top up the tax rate at home, what you will do is take away the competitive advantage that small countries like ours seek to have in this world of high competition. So either way, you hurt an economy like Barbados. Whether you allow us to tax the rate that we choose to tax, and then you top it up there, it means that businesses see no need, therefore, to come here. Might as well stay home. Might as well stay home. Or you set a hard and fast rate, which must be applied globally, and you capture economies such as ours. Now, my reading of this situation, since I learned that we were going to discuss this bill today, suggests to me that this recent G7 move reflects further or additionally a desire to recoup some of the monies which would have been expended in fighting the impact of COVID in their own jurisdictions. And some of these industrialized countries, as well off as they may be, have incurred significant debt in responding to the COVID impact upon their home jurisdictions. And here is an attempt to grab back some money from the pockets of those who don't have the means, because we were faced with the same COVID threat. We were taxed and stretched and incurred significant levels of debt to respond to COVID. Their experience is similar, but how do you compensate for that? What we do is that we're going to borrow to repay debt. What they do is that they grab back from us what otherwise would come to us through legitimate business. And that is what is happening here, Mr. Speaker. So my honorable friend finds himself caught in this thing, and he must lead the charge for our blessed country. And I wish him well, and we will not fight against the inclusion in the legislation of a clause that captures partnerships. I do believe that partnership should be better defined perhaps in the legislation. If it doesn't apply to all types of partnerships, I learned that I didn't even know that there were so many different types of partnerships. But I'm going to assume that every type and any type of partnership is captured in the legislation under the broad term partnerships. But I don't hold the view, as he does. I don't see this thing in static terms, and I believe that you will see a significant increase in that entity defined as partnerships under Barbados law, and that we have to properly provide for such. Thank you, sir.
Honorable Member for St. Michael South Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I almost feel as if I need not rise to my feet, because the Honorable Leader of the Opposition did such a wonderful job of not just supporting the amendment before this honorable place, but also quite ably, as if he were on this side, representing a position really that this Barbados Labour Party administration has for the last 3 years been taking to the world. You know, there's work that has to be done domestically as ministers, as members of parliament, to make sure that we bring all Barbadians along in these extremely perilous times. But that is not to say that there's not also similar and extremely important work that has to be done externally. And I will come to it in a moment, sir, to talk about the reasons that we make the investments that we make in our external positions. But I want to pick up very much, as I rise to support this amendment, from where the honourable member who introduced this, the member for St. Michael North, ended. And it is to say a little bit about what is on the lips of Barbadians. Those who spoke before me have treated to it. But as others have said, following the decision of the ministers of the G7 countries, what are categorized as the world's most developed nations, following their support of this idea of a global minimum tax, rate of tax. That is all anyone can talk about. And there's a good reason why. We are in a time, sir, and please permit me to put some of this in context. We are in a time, sir, where there are several mixed messages that we are receiving as developing nations. We have had to deal with the pandemic. We have had to contend with a situation of vaccine inequity for many months, when access to a vaccine would have made all of the difference in our capacity to recover early. We've similarly had to deal with, and continue to have to deal with, this adherence, this stubborn adherence of the international community to ways of classifying countries like ours that make no sense for global development. It is one thing to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and to say to countries all over the world, you must meet, you should meet. If you care anything about people and development and poverty alleviation, you must meet these 17 goals. Whenever we ask about the means of implementation of all of these global compacts, you can hear crickets, sir. And what are the means of implementation? Means of implementation means, how are countries going to be provided with the wherewithal to do all these things for our populations? The Sustainable Development Goals cover everything from reducing poverty to climate to improving access to education to every single aspect of development. So we're being told, invest in meeting the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. We are also being told, and this week Barbados will submit what is called our nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. Nationally determined contributions are what all of the countries that have signed the Paris Agreement to stop global warming must submit and must report on in order to say, what is it that countries are going to do to make sure that we hold global warming at least 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees. Now, we've said as small states, as small islands, and a report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change showed us in 2018 and continues to show us that even at 1.5 degrees of warming, 1.5 degrees Celsius of the world's warming, that we are still at disadvantage. Countries like ours are already seeing, and we saw that freak storm, sir, what we're calling a freak storm, but which regrettably, more and more, could potentially come to be the norm for countries like ours. Because countries like Barbados, countries in this part of the world, countries in the Pacific, islands like ours, are increasingly threatened and have already started to experience temperatures that are higher than the average. We've already started to see sea level rise, drought conditions. Barbados is one of the most water scarce countries in the world. So we've already started to see the effects of climate change. But what has the international community done? What they've done is said, right, yeah, okay, so we know that you don't contribute to the greenhouse gas emissions really, but we still need you to commit to reducing emissions. And we'll help you, but we'll help you reduce emissions. We will help you less on the things that you need to do, like make sure that you help Barbadians to retrofit their roofs and get their homes in such a condition that we don't have roofs blowing off and homes being destroyed when we have a storm of an intensity that is related to the changes that we're seeing in climate. So we have a situation where what we call adaptation measures, so the things that countries need to do to make sure we have adequate roofs in place, that we have building codes in place, that people have the wherewithal to build to code, those things they're investing less in. They're happy to invest in renewable energy, and we're happy to see the investments in renewable energy. We're extremely happy. It's one of the fastest growing sectors that we have currently. But what is the point I'm trying to make, sir? The point I'm trying to make is that you want a country like to invest more in emissions. We've said to the international community, we need to see at least half of the money that you're allocating to climate change go to help us retrofit our buildings, go to help us underground our utilities, go to help us make sure that every Barbadian is living in stable and secure conditions. That's the investment that we want. We want 50% of climate investment to go there, but we've only seen 20% so far. The world promised at least 100 billion in climate investment. We haven't reached that figure. And that figure woefully underestimates the kinds of investments that we need to make. So we're supposed to meet the SDGs by 2030, but the international community has said to us, good luck with that, because we don't have clear means of implementation. We're supposed to make sure that we are able to adapt to climate change. Again, the international community has completely broken the promises that have been made under the Paris Agreement, something called the Warsaw Mechanism for Loss and Damage, that was supposed to provide the resources. That has not been provided. Can't hear a peep out of the international community on that. And more recently, in response to all of the debt that the world has had to accumulate, because I want to make it clear, Barbados is not the only country borrowing to respond to COVID. In fact, developing nations are borrowing at such a scale and with such concessional terms that they don't need. They're borrowing far more and given far more favorable terms, even with their developed country status, than countries like Barbados. So the entire world has had to borrow to respond to COVID. But even with that understanding, the global community has come up with a debt suspension initiative that applies to 20 countries. But sir, who are the 20 countries? None of the worst performing tourism-based economies in the world qualifies for that debt suspension initiative. So that is no help to us. And further, that initiative freed up 12 billion in liquidity globally. Well, sir, that does not even begin to respond to the resources that countries like Barbados would need globally to be able to respond to COVID and our other development objectives. Sir, last week, we announced, together with the European Investment Bank, a 50 million euro loan that Barbados, my Ministry of Economic Affairs and Investment, negotiated with the EIB for COVID-related health care financing. And why was that important? It was important, and it is important, because one of the things that we need to appreciate, and that I'm encouraging all of us to appreciate, is that when you had to divert resources to spend on COVID, on keeping people alive, those resources had already been allocated to other parts of the health sector. So the resources that we spent to build Harrison's Point, that wasn't pocket change that somebody had lying out. Those had already been allocated. So it meant that critical healthcare investments, although the Ministry of Health was able to build out the accident and emergency department, was able to come up with a cancer care plan, I will tell you, I don't know how they did it. But I'm very proud of how the Ministry of Health and Wellness was able to attend to its regular business. of looking after the health of Barbadians unrelated to COVID, while it was also able to mount one of the best COVID responses the world has seen. It is nothing short, well, I don't want to say magical. It's not magical because people came to work every day to get it done under the leadership of the Honourable Member for the City of Bridgetown and the Honourable Prime Minister. But it meant that they had to do, and we had to do as the Ministry of Finance, Economic Affairs and Investment, you know, what many of our mothers and grandmothers growing up had to do, which was take a little piece from here and put here to make it work. But the reason we had to go to the European Investment Bank, sir, is that we had to be able to retroactively finance the building of Harrison's Point, isolation facility, quarantine facilities. We had to make sure that we had that reinvestment in the health sector so that nothing that we need to meet on behalf of the people of Barbados in terms of health care was compromised. So we asked to meet the SDGs. We asked to respond to climate change. We have to respond to COVID, but the things that they have come up with to suspend that, we can't take advantage of because they're measuring us according to GDP, rather than measuring us according to the ways in which we're actually vulnerable. So, sir, this is why all these external arguments have been important. That is why, sir, on Thursday of this week, we will go to the board of the World Bank to take an operation for what we call exceptional financing in the amount of $100 million US. And sir, that didn't happen just so. This country for decades has been what the World Bank and the IMF call graduated. You know what I mean? What that means? They said to us, y'all making enough GDP per capita, you don't need us anymore to meet your development goals. So go on about your business. And we had to make a strong case, even before COVID, that the basis on which you are graduating us doesn't make any sense. And so we've put that operation together. And that goes this week to be considered by the board of the World Bank. But these are arguments that we have to make. Similarly, the world is set on July 9th to 10th, sir, to endorse the deal that the G7 endorsed, setting a global minimum corporate tax, with a view to it being implemented in October of this year. So while we know that the 15% minimum tax, that number may not hold, we fully expect that some number will apply, and that by the middle of July, we'll have an idea of what the G20 wants to do. But sir, why is this a bad thing? And why does it serve to put countries like ours in the path of further deprivation? It is almost as if one would think that it was a concerted effort to make countries that are small now invisible, to make countries that are small now non-existent. Because perhaps you could pretend not to see us, but I'll tell you that you can't pretend that you can't hear us. But if you are able to completely decimate a country where you can't see or hear it, but that seems to be the mood and the climate of the international development community, even in the heart and the depth of crisis. Now, as others have said before, a single corporate tax rate is terrible for developing countries. It's terrible. Any companies would choose to reside in developed countries that have the same tax rates, but have better developed infrastructure. And sir, the irony is that while we argue for climate adaptation funds to invest in our infrastructure, we are being put at a disadvantage because we're not getting the funds to invest in climate resilient infrastructure so that we can be as competitive as those same developed countries. They know when they set this framework that these firms are going to stay in developed countries. They know that this is not a level playing field. Not only do they know that, but on the left hand, but on the right hand, we aren't seeing the investment in climate adaptation that we are owed under the Paris Agreement. That we are owed, sir. Because under the Paris Agreement, there was an acknowledgement that countries like ours don't contribute to climate change, but we suffer the most from it. The activities of the developed world are slowly killing and decimating our countries. I am not being dramatic. It is in science. There is evidence. It is evidenced by the drought that we're experiencing. It is evidenced by the worst climate events and disaster events that we're experiencing. So the reason why a single tax rate, a single labor rate, a single interest rate for the world is bad, it is that it's unhelpful to development. Because countries need to be able to compete where they are able to compete. Because we can't all compete in the same way, surely. Now, the issue that this tries to address is countries stealing others' taxes, which is a real problem. We understand that. It's not to say that we don't understand that it's a problem. So we don't support that. But there are two ways to deal with that don't get in the way of development. And the Honourable Member for St. Michael North mentioned one, which is substance rules, so that the income that you are taxed on is income derived in that country. Now, as the Honourable Member said, substance was their idea. The Honourable Member for St. Michael North and his team twisted themselves up in knots and lost lots of sleep, but were victorious in bringing to this honourable place legislation that made sure, including this amendment that's before the House now, made sure that we were on good footing with respect to economic substance. Barbados has always sought to be on good footing with respect to economic substance. So the way to address that, to stop countries from stealing each other's corporate tax, is to deal with substance, and the other is to deal with VAT, is to use VAT. If you use value-added tax to capture companies that have revenues in your country but no costs, then that is how you would be able to deal with the issue of countries stealing others' corporate tax. But the fact, sir, that the international bodies like the OECD and others, and the fact that this global minimum tax rate is not focused on things like substance, and is not focused on using things like VAT to capture companies that have revenues in a particular country but don't have costs, is that these things are not the issue. And arguably, the same kind of tax grab which countries like Barbados are being accused of is what this new policy is being used to achieve. Now, sir, as the Honourable Member for St. Michael North said, we are not being taken by surprise with this. We saw this on the horizon. And so the work that is before the House to make sure we're on good footing in terms of economic substance has been part of our response. It has always been the Barbadian way, sir, to make sure that our central strategy is to be a jurisdiction where real substance is carried out. Real economic activity is carried out, and not just one where revenues are being brought to book on an offshore arm of a company, on a Barbadian branch of a company. We know because we have Gildan here. We have Gildan headquartered here, has been for a while. And we expect soon to have an international drinks brand that will also soon be headquartered here. We've been doing lots of work to make sure that we have real economic substance. But the other work and the other response to this is to make sure that we're investing in people. To make sure that people, or Barbadian people, have the right skills to be a part of our thrust towards economic substance and bringing more business to Barbados. So that's the first strategy. Now, the idea of having a carve-out for substance, which says that we will meet the minimum global tax rate, but we expect to get credit for the part of the tax that relates to activities with substance. Well, the honourable members at Michael North and I and others are going to continue to make that argument. I am not sure that the argument will succeed, because I am not sure that the objective that we're being presented with, to stop countries stealing each other's tax, is really the objective. The objective is for the developed country to make more money, to make countries to make more tax, to keep more taxes close to them. So it's not about fair tax practices. It is, in fact, arguably, to make sure that countries like ours cannot increase our revenues and therefore increase our well-being. So there's another strategy that we have, sir. Two other strategies that we have. One is to make sure that we're able to shore up our engagement with Africa and Asia. That's one of the reasons that we've been investing in our economic and financial relationships. That is what lies behind our work to establish a joint regulatory space between Kenya and Barbados. Bring Kenyan technology firms to Barbados, build stronger ties with India, build stronger ties with China. As long as we progress these strategies, having substance, investing in people who can participate in those economic substance activities, and making sure that we continue to engage with that part of the world. You know, I've said in this honorable place before, sir, love who love you. And I believe, sir, that it has to be a part of our engagement strategy, that we continue to focus and invest on a presence in Africa and Asia and other parts of the world where we believe that we can have solidarity on these issues. But, sir, we're also looking at ways to incentivize science and research here in Barbados. We have a science, technology, and business park that will be coming soon, and we're looking at ways of attracting the world's largest research and development spending companies if those rich countries move to a minimum corporate tax rate. And, sir, we can't get into all of the areas of this proposal that we believe will respond to the minimum global tax rate. We are in discussions with the authorities on these. But to say, sir, that we are not being caught off guard, but the fact that we're not being caught off guard does not mean that countries like ours can continue to hop, skip, and jump whenever those countries in the international community, or whenever the international community decides to find another way to penalize us. Sir, in my final minute, I will say that yesterday, the Honorable Prime Minister was in a conversation with a noted economics professor, economics and sustainable development professor. And one of the things that ran through that discussion, ran through the wonderful remarks of the Vice Chancellor prior to that discussion having started. One of the things that ran through that was the fact that, and I believe the Vice Chancellor said it verbatim, the Caribbean has paid its dues. The Caribbean has paid its dues, sir. But we are failing to receive what is owed to us. Now, this government has set a target for being fossil fuel free by 2030. We don't contribute much to emissions, but we're doing our very best to make sure that what we can remove from the atmosphere that is damaging to human life, that we're removing. We have complied fully with first the OECD and then the EU. We have started the discussions to see how we can look at this issue of global minimum tax rate, because we don't support harmful tax practices. But that's not what this is about. And so, in support, sir, of this change to this legislation, I want to say finally that these may seem like esoteric issues. These may seem like things that are not bread and butter issues, but they are. Because if we don't protect our right to decide where we have an advantage, where the kinds of policies that we want to set, then we don't have sovereignty in deciding how and when and how soon our people can develop. Everything we are discussing here this morning affects every single person in Flagstaff, Clapham, Carrington Village, Britton's Hill. It affects every person in Barbados. And it's the reason that we need to continue to invest in having our voices heard. We need to continue to invest in having an external presence, and we need to make sure that Barbados, having paid its dues, gets what we are owed and gets what we are fairly due. I'm obliged to you.
Honourable Member St. James Central.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I welcome the opportunity just to say a few words on this debate. As I listen to honourable members, the mind goes back a little bit, and I perhaps now begin to sound a little long in the tooth, sir, because I have been participating in this debate, not debates of this type, but not literally this debate either, this particular bill before the House, but debates of this type rather, since 2003. And the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, sir, the more things change, the more they have remained the same. And that is in spite of what I believe to be, for the most part, the very genuine efforts of successive governments. And having begun my career in public life in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, I must tell you, Mr. Speaker, sir, I've had the opportunity to sit at the level of CARICOM, not only at the CARICOM trade ministers level, but at the sitting with the head of government at the CARICOM heads level, and recognizing, sir, that that which we are complaining about is equally true of most of the member states, if not all, of CARICOM. And I was struck by some of the closing comments of the honourable member who just took her seat, because, Mr. Speaker, sir, the fact of the matter is she is entirely right. We ought not to be, or our citizens, the Barbadian public, ought not to be in a position where they are relating to these issues as though they are something that they don't understand or that they are new. And perhaps the fault is, sir, a collective one, a collective responsibility, not only of members of parliament, but quite frankly, influencers in this society, leaders of national organizations, members of the press. This, sir, is something that we have gone over and over and over again, and it just manifests itself in different form. The labor movement is compromised, Mr. Speaker, sir, when the governments of the international world speak about de-risking banks in Barbados. They are effectively saying to us that it is too risky, and by extension, de-risking banks in the Caribbean. It is too much of a risk to have banking relations with the state of Belize, with the state of Barbados, with the state, and you go on through the region. And let us not fool ourselves, sir. That has happened. Equally, it is a matter of concern for capital now. I just spoke about labor, but for the Chamber of Commerce in Barbados, when they are told equally in the same breath that correspondent banking becomes an issue, and the ability to move funds. And we need, sir, to recognize that these are the existential challenges, the challenges to our very existence that are manifesting themselves. A parent who has a child at university, that child is not able to do his or her degree in the University of the West Indies structure because that child is exceptionally gifted and wants to go into a field that UWI does not yet have the skill sets and ability to offer. So it might be a neurosurgery, for example, sir. But that child can't achieve his or her dream if the parent can't move the funds from Barbados to pay the university costs wherever it is that the child is at. But when once you hear about an assault on correspondent banking relationships, it means that that parent now sits in a state of terror. What do I do to make sure that my child doesn't fall on, or his ambitions, her ambitions don't fall on infertile soil? How do I get out of this state of powerlessness? That is what effectively has been inflicted on the people that we represent, Mr. Speaker, sir, time after time, month after month, and year after year, by the fragility of this sector that we call the international business sector, and the way in which the international, I don't want to just keep saying international, either let's be very focused and very targeted and very real, the way in which the North Atlantic community treats to us. And Mr. Speaker, sir, you know, I understand very well that they have their own politically heated discussions. You listen to the BBC, you watch CNN, you see it on both sides of the North Atlantic. There was a gentleman who recently demitted office in the United States of America, and he has been replaced by a gentleman who has initiated this conversation about a 15% tax rate. But the man who he replaced equally was verbally hostile towards this region in terms of his views as well. And we have to understand that those communities are fraught with tension. For them, the majority, numerical majority, racially numerical majority, sees itself as threatened by minorities and the presence of minorities in their countries. They are concerned about immigration in their countries. They are concerned, Mr. Speaker, sir, about the demands made by the minority for better health care, better education, especially in their inner cities. And Mr. Speaker, sir, there is a challenge on the financial infrastructure of those countries. But that in and of itself, though I understand that, cannot justify the turning of the tables to, as the leader of the opposition said, claw back from the small islands of the Caribbean, from the developing states who have done everything we were told we had to do. And you know, Mr. Speaker, sir, there's a little bit of history of this that is very important if our people are to understand the challenge we deal with, because there was a president of the United States of America called Ronald Wilson Reagan. And in 1983, he would have signed the Caribbean Basin Recovery Act. And that Caribbean Basin Recovery Act came to be known as the Caribbean Basin Initiative. But effectively, sir, it was about all these things that we are now talking about. A program by the United States government with the aim of economic development driven by private sector and looking primarily at trade. It, sir, reached out almost with a sweetheart deal to the countries of CARICOM in particular and to the countries of Central America. And they, yes, please, the countries of CARICOM and Central America. And they basically, sir, encouraged us to embark on this journey of an international business sector. That's where it finds its genesis. And we go into an international business sector, Mr. Speaker, sir, recognizing that, as the Honorable Minister who presented the bill points out, money is mobile. It is geographically mobile. And the fact is that you can have 1/4 of your business operations set up here, and you can have the other 3/4 elsewhere. You can have people who are here doing certain administrative and back-end operations, while the people who are involved in industry and, the industrial manufacturing, et cetera, are elsewhere. And capital will always look for the best possible deal it can find. That is why the Caribbean and by extension Latin America, or put it the other way around, because the worst performing economies are quite frankly in Latin America. Why Latin America and the Caribbean has been such a place of interest for investment, because they would like to go and pay workers as little as possible. Now, Mr. Speaker, sir, what then did we do? We said, okay, we're going to go into this. And after we go into it and make very strident achievements in this new sector. Thank you. Another president by the name of Bill Clinton, in, I believe it was the year 2000, signed the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act. And that act, Mr. Speaker, sir, aimed at enhancing trade preference relationships with the United States of America. And again, we're coming now to duty-free and quota-free entry into the United States of America, subject to a few prescriptions that the Europeans have caught on to. So back then, they were telling us that if we are going to look after workers properly, as though we needed a lecture on how to look after workers, because at no time has Barbados ever had a challenge in terms of its government relationship with labor. All of our political parties have been born out of labor and its relationship with labor. In fact, both of them carry the term labor in the middle of the party's name. There's only one party. I shouldn't say one, because of the National Democratic Party. I was going to say there's only one party that was ever represented in the Parliament of Barbados that did not carry the term labor as part of its name, but there are two. But the second one, sir, speaks of people. So I presume that by extension, it captures labor. And I listened to the leader of that party, and he certainly spoke in the language of a person who understands the commitment of labor this morning. Well, Mr. Speaker, sir, the fact of the matter is that the conditions that they sought to apply to us, that you have to be protecting the rights of workers to associate freely, that you have, Mr. Speaker, sir, to be able to protect the rights of workers to organize and bargain freely. These are the kind of lectures that we got from Washington, D.C., Mr. Speaker, in 2000, when we've been doing that since Adam was a little boy. Cooperation, sir, but this is where it started now to get interest into the European Union, when they started to insist that we must cooperate on matters relating to counter-narcotic efforts, and relating, Mr. Speaker, sir, to the Inter-American Convention on Corruption, and so on. Things that had absolutely nothing to do with the development of, I shouldn't say have absolutely nothing, but had little to do with the development of private sector activity in the Caribbean. But there were ways of reaching into the governance structure. And in spite of an independent state being an independent sovereign state, you are trying to control the reins of administration from across the water. Europeans learned well that this, because they need little instruction on doing these things, they initiated colonialism, you will recall. And they, Mr. Speaker, sir, recognize that they too can get involved in this game. And so we have now these amorphous entities, some of which, quite frankly, were of questionable origin, constitutionally dubious when they first emerged, like the Organization European, what OECD, where is that from? I can't even remember. But the fact of the matter is these loosely configured entities, Mr. Speaker, that by virtue of their global might and their reach must be noticed. But then they come to you and they make determinations about what you are and are not to do and how soon you're to do it and when you're to do it. And in that regard, I do empathize with the comments of the leader of the opposition. And if I have given this speech 15 times in my nearly 20 years on these premises, Mr. Speaker, every time I've said the same thing. There has to be a point at which we as a region push, not necessarily push back, but push against these things that seek to undermine everything that we are standing for. Because the leader, the Minister of International Business is quite right. Not only did they ask us to go down the road of economic substance, further than that, they are the people who invited us to go into this business in the first place. It was back when Reagan was around that they opened this avenue of economic activity. And they said, look, come here, go this route. And we went there and have shaped the future of the people of this region on that developmental trajectory in large measure. Only now that you get 3/4 of the way down the road to hear that you can't do that no more, that the goalpost has to be shifted, that the objectives that they come to you and tell you, treat to your people and your country's development in this way, that all of a sudden that is not going to work because it is no longer comfortable to folks in Washington, or alternatively in London, or alternatively in any other capital of Europe. And Mr. Speaker, sir, that really is what the challenge is for us. And we are at a stage where, I think Leave the Opposition made the point, there's a very real danger of having the competitive advantage of the region, and in this particular case of Barbados, eroded. We are building beyond just a tax rate, and I think everybody understands the point that the Minister of International Business made. We came into this, Mr. Speaker, sir, and very early in the process, we decided to do all the things that we needed to do. We repealed the legislation that was considered to be problematic. We then engaged in the tax convergence, which dismantled 40 years, Mr. Speaker, sir, of the tax structures that we had here. I take his point that beyond what the previous administration committed to but did not do, we had to come and do it. And I remember well that it was in December of the first year that we were in, December 22nd, on the eve of Christmas. While elsewhere, folks were merrily Christmasing and caroling, we were seated in the Parliament doing the business of the people on the 22nd of December to make sure that we were compliant and that there was no blacklisting of the country, Mr. Speaker. And beyond the tax rate, we have done our best to make sure that this country can continue to compete on issues which are fundamental. People make choices, and they're invited to make the choices in the international business sector on a number of things. The tax rate is but one of them. But obviously, beyond that, is the quality of life. You come to Barbados, Mr. Speaker, sir, and you are able to enjoy a quality of life that, quite frankly, is comparable to most of these world-class entities who now sit in judgment of us. There are places in France that I would never want to go. Let us be very real about that. I have seen horror stories that should not be told in polite company about what takes place in London City, Mr. Speaker. I see it with my own eyes. One of the nastiest, filthiest places that you could find when you walk through London. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, sir, you're not supposed to say that because you might offend. But we all know it is true. When you arrive in the United States of America, in New York City, it is the international business capital of the world. But we know it leaves a lot to be desired. We know this. So let us not believe that because people live in big buildings and they drive in 5, 10-lane highways, that, Mr. Speaker, sir, their quality of life is automatically that much better. So we compete on that. We compete, Mr. Speaker, sir, struggle to compete on the question of the ease of doing business. Now, obviously, the Barbados Labour Party administration does not have complete control of that because there is a democracy. And from time to time, the people of Barbados have gotten upset with us and in their wisdom have chosen to put other people at the reins of government. And when that has happened, without failure, there has been a collapse of the ease of doing business in this country. And then as day follows night, we have to come in and try to fix that. Right now, we are in the process of moving Barbados from where it was, where we found it, rated at about 150 somebody, or possible 190, in order to make it respectable once again. And within the first few weeks, one of the major things that was a humbug, which was the town and country planning legislation in this country, was transformed and made right by this administration, Mr. Speaker, sir. And we go on and on and on. The skill sets of the workforce to which the Honourable Member of St. Michael South Central referred to, we compete on that because labor in this country has always been put at the forefront. And that is why when others would have seen our young children sit alongside the road and not continue education at University of the West Indies because they could not pay fees, we said, no, we must reinvest in the workforce of Barbados, reinvest in the progeny of the people that vote for us, and make sure that their children could go back into university. We did that within the first few weeks of this government as well, Mr. Speaker, sir. We compete on infrastructure at world-class levels. We compete, yeah, that's right, they said it could not be done, and it was done. We compete on infrastructure of world-class levels. Ever so often, sir, the people in the exercise of their wisdom change the reins of administration. And then we have to come back and take sewage off the streets. Mr. Speaker, we got to come and spend millions of dollars to fix roads that were never touched. And all of the cabinet has had to in some form or fashion, ask their constituents, all of the members of this parliament, ask their constituents to bear with the inconvenience, the dust, the noise, etc. I go through that on a daily basis on the West Coast, because a road that could not be touched for God knows how many years is now being completely redone. And Mr. Speaker, sir, we compete on the basis of a global focus. And you heard the member for St. Michael's South Central just speak to it. To shift the view away from the North Atlantic, because our history, yes, has been tied to them. But our destiny, Mr. Speaker, sir, does not have to be tied to them. And while we are going to coexist with the folks in the North Atlantic to the best of our ability, we want them to understand that this now has to be a dialogue among people who see themselves as equals, as global citizens. And this is where I believe I must agree with the Leader of the Opposition, that the conversation that the country must have must be at a regional level. It must be a conversation where we say to the North Atlantic in particular that you are now putting yourself in a situation where you're about to go a yard too far, and that you are dealing with people who are equals as global citizens, and that you cannot just from month to month and week to week, yeah, we can comply. We're going to comply because we don't want any unseemly noise. But what will it be next time? And how many times have you, Mr. Speaker, sir, sat in that chair and heard that question be asked? What will the European Union ask of us next time? We step in line because you ask us to step in line. But enough never seems to be enough. There's always some new way of saying, look, you ain't doing it the way we want to do. And it is not that we have failed. It is, Mr. Speaker, sir, that they have an issue in terms of revenue. Having created a global structure where you say, you invite people to have companies move freely around the world, invest where they care to, find the best possible places of locating themselves and that which they want to do so as to get returns, so that we build up, Mr. Speaker, sir, treaties where we give rights and respect those rights and defend those rights, sir, for people to have their investment and to pursue their respective interests. And Barbados has a network of treaties, sir, with countries all around the world. But when they have some problems at home and they have to look for some cash to resolve it, they come hunting in our direction to claw back. And Mr. Speaker, sir, that is the conversation that we have to have. And I feel very strongly that, especially with regard to our friends in the United States of America, I was the most surprised person, quite frankly, when a gentleman who, I must tell you, I supported his president when his president was president, a gentleman by the name of Barack Obama, and so therefore Vice President Biden would have been my natural choice of candidate to support. I ain't gotten a vote up there, but you know, I felt a little proud to have a Biden sticker. And I felt a little proud to have conversations with Americans and urge them, Barbadians in the diaspora, and urge them. So I was a little bit humbugged, Mr. Speaker, sir. A good old Barbadian phrase to mean that you were put out. You're a little bit offended when of all people, this suggestion would come from that source. I mean, the universal taxation thing will obviously not accord with Barbados's interests. And sir, that it comes from that particular source is worrisome. And I feel that we must now have the kind of conversation with our folks up there, because there are a lot of Barbadians in the diaspora. Some say there may be more in the diaspora than there are here. But I also know there are a lot of Jamaicans in the diaspora, a lot of Trinidadians in the diaspora, a lot of Grenadians in the diaspora. And Mr. Speaker, sir, it also offends some of the folks in Latin America. And we must have the conversation with those people who are also offended, so that their diaspora can also be involved. And that next time there's an election coming around, these types of issues need to be put on the table. That part of the conversation has to be, well, how are you going to treat to these issues without kicking the stuffing and breaking the bottom out of the islands in the Caribbean and the countries in Central America, which have cooperated with you when you wanted to have a third border to the south, which have cooperated with you on issues fundamental to you, like anti-money laundering and on anti-corruption and on fighting narco-traffickers, Mr. Speaker, sir. We have been there. Never were we wanting, never were we failing to hear the bugle that sounded. We came to their assistance, changed legislation, did all the things that were required to do to make sure that these best practices were prosecuted. And now, Mr. Speaker, sir, what about the best practices for our society? Does that not have to be part of the conversation too? Ought that not to be part of the structured approach by the ministries of foreign affairs of the region? Ought that not to be the structured engagement at the State Department level, Mr. Speaker, sir? And I think we begin there, and we have to have the same kind of discussion with the folks in the other side of the pond in North Atlantic. Because we are talking about the existence of a people, of a civilization. And we cannot, with the best wishes in the world, believe, and again, I think the leader of the opposition is right, we can't believe that it ends here now, that this is the last chapter. It has never been the last chapter. When I heard about correspondent banking, I was shocked, Mr. Speaker, because I could not understand for the life of me how you could have a jurisdiction like Barbados or Trinidad, well-run small economies, and you would actually have a conversation going on at global level that these people, all of a sudden, the banking system is not going to be accepted in North Atlantic, and that you can move your money to make sure that your businesses are able to acquire necessary imports, or that your children, as I said, can't be financed, their education can't be financed overseas, or, Mr. Speaker, sir, that family members can't send a little bit of remittance to their people here in the Caribbean when they're up there making sure that your economy grows. Well, I was shocked. And I thought that had to be the end. But it was not the end. And the question is, will it ever be the end if we do not let our voices be heard in the most robust way, universally and collectively, sir, on these matters? And I feel, sir, that I just wanted to say those few words about this. As I said, it is not the first time I've shared this view, and I suspect it will not be the last time I have to share this view. But, sir, I feel philosophically that it is a view to which I would want to see all of Barbados, and by extension, all of this region aligned. I am obliged to you, sir.
Honourable Member for St. Michael North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to congratulate all honorable members and compliment all honorable members who spoke. I think that really and truly in my 26, going on 27 years in this chamber now, that the speeches I've just heard really are among the best, most mature, and most informative that I've heard in any debate in this chamber. And I have really heard quite a lot of debates in here, and this really has been a very, very high standard and quality of debate, and I thank them for the suggestions they have made. I'm not going to detain the House much longer, just to say that, to clarify one thing I hope wasn't misinterpreted in my comments. All that I say in terms of our compliance with the requirements and regulations and stipulations and so on to be a well-regulated jurisdiction and compliant with international standards. You know, I see these as things, yes, we have to do, but I see them also as things we do in the short term. I do not believe that any country in the world, particularly small developing countries around the world, can be expected to continue just to dodge bullets and so on, coming at them all the time from these big colonizers. And I believe that we have to recognize that we have to take some more serious action to stand up for our rights going forward. I remember years ago when the situation presented itself to the then Prime Minister, the late Professor Owen Arthur. He took a stand that went the length of maybe just a little bit outside of court action, and there was a quick retreat by the OECD. And I really believe that we have to recognize that at this time we are dealing with some of the most brutal types of colonizers that exist. And the behavior of the European Union in these matters in particular shows us that they have not forgotten that there are former colonial masters who intend to revisit us again, even in these times. The type of brutal savagery that they inflicted on us some years ago. I really believe that. And I therefore, while I play along, I recognize that this is short-term response. But I believe that the same way that they will look upon us and smile and laugh with us and treat, if you have ever traveled, Mr. Speaker, to any part of Europe, you see the way in which a minister or any leader of a delegation is treated like royalty, at least on the face of it. But they will laugh at you and they will still blacklist you. And you have to recognize that as a reality. So we have to fight back. And I do believe that the way to resolve this issue, hopefully once and for all, is to recognize that there's an international court of justice to hear and determine these matters. I recognize the role of consultants. I recognize the role of great economic advisors. I recognize the role of lobbyists. But I have also had the benefit of 3 years to be in direct contact with these forces. And I recognize, Mr. Speaker, that they do not play. Simply put, they do not play. And really and truly, until Barbados can't do it alone, not in terms of voice, not in terms of financial resources that will be necessary to be expended to really assert our rights, but it has to be done. And I believe that our time has to be well spent in time to come, ensuring that we can muster enough support regionally and internationally to mount a serious challenge in a court of law. When a court of law pronounces, its decisions and judgments are binding and will have to be executed. And that is the direction, Mr. Speaker, that I believe that ultimately, sooner in fact rather than later, that we as a small developing island state will have to go to avoid being pushed around. When we jumped through the hoop, Mr. Speaker, of converting our tax rate, we really thought that by and large the battle was over. We really did. It was not easy to dismantle something you had in place for 40 years. It was not easy. We really thought, in fact, the expression that I think the Prime Minister used then was that we cannot continue dodging bullets. That is why we decided to converge and embark on unknown territory. So far, it seems to be paying off. But to wake up every day, as some other honorable members have said, not knowing what it holds for you, what will come to us, another directive, is a daunting prospect, Mr. Speaker. So I believe we have the same way that they will smile with us and inflict the cat and nine on us, or the cutlass, or whatever they call it. We need also to smile with them, but to take their actions before an international adjudicator to have ourselves protected once and for all. With those few remarks, Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Questions that the bill be read a second time. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Me think the ayes have it. The question is that the Speaker do not leave the chair and the House resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Me think the ayes have it.
Clause 1. Minister Topping. Two.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clause 2 stand part.
Report.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honour the Speaker the passing of one bill in committee.
The chairman of committees has reported the passing of one bill in committee. Our member for St. Michael North.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that this bill be read a third time.
Question is that the aforementioned bill be read a third time. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Me think the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that this bill do not pass and be cited as the company's economic substance amendment bill 2021.
The question is that this bill be passed and so cited. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Me think the ayes have it. This bill is passed and so cited. Honourable Leader of Government Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move the suspension of the sitting until 1:45 p.m.
Till
1:45 p.m.
The question that this honourable chamber stands suspended until 1:45 p.m. All those honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Me think the ayes have it. This honourable chamber stands suspended until 1:45 p.m.